Hi everyone, this is Allison from Micah, and you are here to learn about how to use the annual report to advocate and have communications. So, I just want to let you know that you're all on mute. We will be taking questions throughout the webinar, so if you could just type those into the chat box, we will be sure to highlight those. And this webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted on our Facebook page after, as well as I will be sending it out to attendees. There's two handouts. There's the actual annual report as well as this PowerPoint. Those will also be sent to you after the webinar. In addition, we'll be sending you a survey. If you could fill it out so we know if the content that we're providing is helpful, as well as you'll get a certificate of attendance. It is not for CEUs, just for you to have, will come as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Laurel.
Hi, everyone. This is Laurel, also with the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. And Allison, are you advancing the slides for us?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I'm joined today, obviously, by my coworker Allison, as well as Jerry Leslie, who will be speaking a little bit more about his perspective working with the data. We're really excited to talk with you about this issue of communications and advocacy and using the annual report, the Campaign to End Homelessness annual report, to assist you in those efforts. So at this time, I'm going to launch a quick poll just to check in with all of you. The annual report has been out for a few weeks now, and I'm just curious if you on the call have had a chance to actually read the report. So the question, have you had the chance to read the 2019 annual report yet? Your options are, of course, I caught the highlights, it's on my to read pile, and what's the annual report? If you attended our webinar 2 weeks ago, where Jerry ran through the data and really did a deep dive into the report, you will recognize these questions. And I'm hoping that if you answered that it was on your to read pile at that time, you can now say that you've read it. And I'm seeing that we have about 3/4 of you who have voted, so I'm just going to yammer on for another 5 seconds or so and let you all cast your vote. And then I'll go ahead and share the results with all of you. So it looks like half of you still have it on your to read pile, which is great. This is going to be a primer for you then to kind of understand the development of the report and how we're hoping that you can use it in your advocacy and communications. But I'm grateful to know that some of you have read it or at least looked at the highlights. For those of you who said, what's the annual report? You're about to learn. So Allison, if you can go on to the next slide. A little bit about the annual report. The annual report is a product of the Campaign to End Homelessness, which is a statewide effort of state leaders, agencies, nonprofits, providers who are guiding our state's response to preventing and ending homelessness in the state. Every year, we put out a report that uses data, primarily HMIS, to tell the story of what homelessness looks like. It's always about a year behind. This year, we're a little bit later than usual because of this little thing called COVID. It's kind of pushed us all back. So we've just released the 2019 annual report, which of course pulls from 2019 data. The writing team comes together for months to discuss how we put this together, what information we want to feature, how we want this to be used, and what story we want to tell. And so a couple things that were different this year that I wanted to share with you all to kind of give you a little bit of context is, in addition to HMIS, we brought in some new data sources and really tried to highlight some various resources for all of you when you're using this report to not just rely on HMIS, because we have Jerry on the call. We all know that Jerry and his team do an amazing job, and all of the sysadmins out in your communities do an amazing job pulling in the HMIS data that talks about what homelessness and those experiencing homelessness looks like in your community. But it's just part of the story, right? So we also pulled in data from the Kids Count, from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, from the CSH Racial Disparities and Disproportionality Index, and other sources as well. And we're hoping that this tells a more full story of what homelessness looks like in our state. We also made the conscious decision to focus on disparities. We have for years been talking about racial and health disparities within the report, but this year we called it out, and we called it out in every page of the subpopulation section. So Allison mentioned that the report is a handout on this webinar. You can go ahead and download it right now and skim through it and look at all those subpopulation pages. I'll be pulling up examples from those as we go through this webinar. But each one of those pages calls out a racial or health disparity, so that we're not just talking about it at the front of the report, we're talking about it throughout. This is something that we want to be a focus, and that we're hoping all of you will kind of lift up in your own work around the report. And then we're moving beyond the data. Data tells an important story, but it's just, again, part of the story. If we don't have that historical, cultural, societal information, we're not providing the context. We can talk about numbers, and we can recognize the value that those numbers have when trying to address these concerns and the issues of homelessness in the state. But there's that old adage that, you know, one is a problem. Lots of numbers, when you get up into the hundreds and thousands and you're talking about data, then it's just data. It's not anything that people can relate to. It's not anything that people can connect with and want to be involved in. So we're trying to tell that more full story by moving beyond the data. Allison, can I have you move on? But we do need to talk about the data a little bit. So what did we learn from the 2019 report? There were over 61,832 people who were literally homeless at some point in the calendar year of 2019. The map on your page is directly from the annual report, and it does show for you kind of a breakdown based on the 10 prosperity regions, the percentage of the total population of homelessness for the state. And then the little chart at the bottom actually shows you the increase and decrease over the past several years, the past 3 years, for each one of those regions. So if you are a homeless service provider, or if you are a volunteer or an advocate, you can look at this map and see where you fall in the region, and identify kind of where your data is coming from and where that places you with regards to other regions in the state. The executive summary in this report does a really good job of talking about our successes and where there's room for growth. So, celebrating our successes. We did have a lot of things that were really great in 2019 that we wanted to celebrate and we wanted to highlight throughout this report. One of those things was the cross-sector collaboration between the Department of Corrections and MSHDA in putting forward housing choice vouchers for those who are returning citizens, or those who are leaving jail or prison, or going back into their communities. So we have a wonderful spotlight page that talks about that cross-sector collaboration and the impact that it's had. And again, we wanted to celebrate and spotlight this program because it talks about some of those things that go beyond the data. It talks about the history and the societal pressures that affect that population. It really sets the stage for us to start talking about systems and barriers and opportunities. In addition to that, we also wanted to highlight the declines in homelessness. So there were a couple subpopulations where we actually saw homelessness going down, which is fantastic, obviously. We also wanted to recognize those Michigan communities that were recognized by the USICH for ending veteran homelessness. So you can see we have 6 different communities who were able to be recognized through that in 2019. And then we wanted to highlight legislative victories. We've rolled this into our report in past years, but we wanted to call them out specifically and directly here so that those who are reading the report recognize that there are ways for us to affect policy that has a positive impact on our populations. So in 2019, we were able to increase the ESP per diem. Back in 2017, that per diem was $12. Over the past several years, we've seen a $2 or $1 increase each year, and we've now gotten to $18 per diem. We also were able to create access to free birth certificates for people experiencing homelessness. And for many of you who are involved in direct services, you know just how hard it is to be able to get a birth certificate from the state of Michigan, not even mentioning those that are outside of the state of Michigan. So this is a huge win for us and something that we need to be celebrating. But in addition to recognizing and celebrating, we also need to talk about the challenges. So in 2019, there are a lot of things that we wanted to highlight throughout the report that talked about the barriers that people are facing. The first one is income. The average monthly income for a person experiencing homelessness is only $662, which is not enough money to afford rent and living expenses in Michigan. We'll talk about that a little bit further on when we talk about how we can use this report in our communications. But that's something that really sets a good base for us when we're talking about the affordability of housing in the state of Michigan. Again, calling out disparities, more than 40% of the homeless population have long-term mental and physical health conditions. Despite this fact, and this is where we talk about some of the success as well, people experiencing homelessness are less likely to have health insurance than the general population. We'll talk about Medicaid later on, and we'll talk about some of the systems that allow for Medicaid increases for the population there too. And then despite deepening our understanding of how far-reaching racial inequity is within the housing and homeless service system, there's still a lot of work that we need to do. And we'll talk about race much more directly as we get farther along in the presentation. So using the report in your communications. Let me launch another poll really quickly. And here, we're wanting to know who you typically share the annual report with. If I've done this correctly, and I definitely have not in the past, but it looks like I have this time, you should be able to select more than one. But for those of you who are familiar with the report and have used it in the past, or with the 2019 report currently, are you sharing them with funders, with those decision makers, whether that the state, the congressional, the local councilor or county commission level, your staff, volunteers, people who you are serving, perhaps general public, and that could be done through social media or through events. I know we're not all holding a lot of events right now in person at least, but thinking back to when we were all able to gather and have fundraising events or awareness raising events, did you have a copy of the annual report out or the executive summary out for people to look at? And then of course, the media. When you're talking to members of your local media outlets, are you including the annual report so that they have a reference for what homelessness looks like throughout the state and in your region? And fewer people are voting in this poll. Either people are stepping away or not as many people have actually been able to use the annual report in the past. So I'll go ahead and close and share the results. So that's fantastic that we are getting this report out to so many different audience members. I see that we have a large percentage of people who use it in their general public outreach with their funders. And that makes a lot of sense to me because you want to be able to show your funders the impact that we're having and where you are situated with regards to homelessness in the state. I'm also excited to see that you guys are using this internally, that you're sharing it with your staff, with your volunteers. And I wish I had more space to kind of divide this up because I'm really curious about how many people are sharing it between the two kind of audiences there, your staff and volunteers versus your guests and clients, because I think it's a really exciting way to engage people with lived experience as well, right? It's a chance to talk about the broader system, the broader experience of homelessness in our state. And then fewer people are using it with the media. So let's start talking about that a little bit and how we can use this report in particular and pulling examples from this report in particular to kind of move the narrative when we're talking about homelessness in the state. So one of the things that the writing team really focused on when developing this report was how we can take lessons that we've learned through studies and through research that has been happening throughout the country and really embed that into the language and the narrative that we want to include in the annual report. So the first thing we wanted to talk about was how we can move away from consumerist thinking. Research tells us that many Americans blame homelessness on the person, not the systems, the history, or the policies that contribute to it. And I'd wager that if I were to put another poll question up right now for all of you to see if this rang true for you and your experience in your communities, I would guess that a lot of you would say that that is correct, that people always want to kind of look at the individual, not the bigger picture. And focusing on demographic data without that additional context actually contributes to this interpretation, this belief that it is the individual who's homeless for a reason, and it is their responsibility to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and find a house and stay housed and get employment that actually can pay for that high rent. And so without adding some more context, people kind of get stuck and are left to that interpretation. So we tried to build in that context throughout this report. And we encourage you to highlight information that takes your audience away from that personal responsibility and towards a better understanding of systemic barriers to ending homelessness. So if you move forward, we have an example from the report that I want to show folks about how we can do this. Now, this is an awkward example to put forward when we're talking about moving away from consumerist mentalities because it's about income. But it is a great example to show that the data is telling us that people can't afford their own rent. The average income, which is something that we highlighted in our executive summary, for a family with children exiting homelessness is only $667 a month. And that is not enough money to be able to afford a 2-bedroom rent in our communities. So the data at the very bottom, or the call out at the very bottom, is directly from the report. And it's acknowledging that the National Low Income Housing Coalition's 2019 Out of Reach report actually gives us an hourly wage that a Michigander needs to be able to earn to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at FMR. And that average for the state is $17.25. But our average Michigan renters only earn $14.96 per hour. And this means that there are too many families with children, single parent households, who are unable to afford an apartment, a rental unit for their family. This is acknowledging that the system, the affordability of rent, the way that our communities provide housing for low-income individuals is not something that people can navigate and manage successfully. And that is not within their control, right? Sure, there are opportunities for people to go out and earn higher wages, but we're trying to build the narrative that for too many people, that is not a realistic opportunity. There are too many barriers, there are too many things within our systems that are preventing them from being able to move upwards. And if we can talk about those systems as a way and the way that they impact the individual, we're no longer placing the blame on the individual. We're talking about the society and the way that that impacts the individual's ability to get out of homelessness and to stay housed. The next piece that we were hoping to accomplish with this annual report is to call our audience in. And I'm assuming, again, that a lot of you use this language already when you're talking about homelessness in your communities. Homelessness can happen to anyone. We use that language about everyone's only a couple paychecks away from potentially experiencing homelessness. And this feels especially true right now, right? Because we have high rates of unemployment, we have medical emergency, we have lack of childcare. There are so many things that are outside of our personal control that impact our finances that take us right up to that edge of homelessness. And this report does not include COVID data. It is back in 2019 before the pandemic started in the country. But that doesn't mean we can't be talking about it. That doesn't mean that we can't be looking forward and talking about how we expect homelessness and how we expect families facing evictions, facing loss of income to be impacted moving forward. And part of that conversation is to recognize that it's not them experiencing homelessness, it's us. All of us could be in this situation. And so we encourage you to highlight information and bring in those stories where people can see themselves. And one thing that you can especially focus on right now during the pandemic are health conditions, the higher rates of disability that those experiencing homelessness have, and how housing and health intersect. In other words, and this is messaging that has actually been tested and has tested well with multiple populations, we need to help people who can't help themselves. And so an example from the annual report is on the next slide, Allison. And it kind of pulls in two different subpopulations that we highlight throughout the report, unaccompanied minors under 18, and then youth ages 18 to 24. And it acknowledges the health disparities, and specifically for those unaccompanied minors, the increasing health disparities that they experience. And the reason why I focus on this population is because this is a population that at this age, a lot of people can look at and say, well, they're so young. Under 18, they are not equipped to be out there finding employment, securing housing. They're still figuring things out. They are not able to help themselves, especially when we talk about the health disparities that they experience as well. And it is our role, our responsibility to help those who can't help themselves. And so kind of incorporating this language and this messaging within our communications kind of opens that door for people to start feeling a little bit more empathy and understanding with those who are experiencing homelessness. The next piece is to create an expectation of collective responsibility. And I kind of highlighted on this already. Homelessness happens in our community. We have the responsibility to do something about it. We're all familiar with NIMBY as not in my backyard. The idea that my community doesn't have homelessness. We don't need to do anything about it. I don't need a shelter. I don't need affordable housing. I don't need any kind of services in my community because it affects me. And we need to counter that by talking about our values. Again, pulling from research, pulling from tested messages. We need to highlight the narrative and the data that our audience feels are unjust. And then we need to start pointing them towards action, because if we're going to have collective responsibility, we need to know what needs to be done in order to solve it. So the example from the annual report, if you could go to the next slide, Allison, is again hitting on a population that we're seeing increases within the state that people can relate to and kind of empathize with. So seniors aged 55 and up in our definition are seeing homelessness at increasing rates, and as that general population increases, we expect to see the homeless population within seniors increase as well. Now, nobody wants to see grandma and grandpa homeless, right? No one wants to feel like their own grandparents could be living in their car, could be living in a shelter, could lose their own home. And so as we are trying to talk about collective responsibility, bring in those narratives, bring in those stories about people who are kind of relatable and that people feel as though they should have responsibility for. Yeah, I think that this health disparity just kind of graphic just kind of emphasizes that the physical health condition of our seniors, there's 65% of those who are experiencing homelessness have a physical health condition, and that is something that we also can all relate to as we get older, as our parents and our grandparents get older. We see them have their own physical health conditions. Now imagine them balancing that and dealing with that on top of not having their own permanent home, and use that, bring in those narratives to kind of relate to people and call them into that action. Next slide. And then finally, this is where it gets especially complicated. Talk about systems, but don't overwhelm. So solutions can seem impossible when we have to dismantle systems. But when we focus on how a system helps or hurt an individual, we make it a little bit more accessible for our audience to understand and relate to. Now, this is that fine balance of bringing an individual narrative without enforcing and emphasizing that consumerist narrative that we're trying to move away from. And so talking about how the system affects the individual, not how the individual's personal actions allow them for success, is going to be key to this. Highlight the narrative and the data in the report that talks about how we got here and the barriers that are keeping folks homeless, such as those low wages and high rents, such as history of segregation when we talk about our racial disparities. And then talk about the areas where the system works, like Medicaid, and bring in those personal narratives to support that. An example from the annual report is on the next slide. So single adults is what we chose to highlight here. The white box is actually pulled from a different page in the annual report where we're talking about health disparities more broadly, and it gives a little bit of context. But when we're talking about single adults, we see that 78% of single adults 25 and older are covered by health insurance. Now, this is a win for us because there are more people who have health insurance, who are able to seek services, or able to seek health care, and it's not a burden on our tax dollars in our society. So talking about how, and I should actually stress here, 78% for single adults is actually lower than the average for those experiencing homelessness in the state. So look through the report and find other examples of where subpopulations have high levels of health insurance. Talk about how the system works and how we need to invest in the system. Bring in that personal narrative though, because otherwise we're talking about a very complicated system that a lot of people who are in power can relate to and understand, but not everybody. And so it's good to kind of find that balance again. And we're hoping that this report, with all of these different talking points, we're hoping that this report provides to you the knowledge, the power, the resource to be able to have those conversations and reference back to something that is published that you can actually hold in your hands or on your computer and send digitally to the people who you're trying to communicate with. And the next slide. These are the reports that we pulled from primarily for this webinar. I use these as often as I can when I'm trying to communicate, and I really encourage you guys to go and look at these research studies. The first one, Piecing It Together, is a couple years old, and it is focused more on affordable housing than homelessness, but it has some excellent tested messaging for the general public that I think really works for the conversation we're having around homelessness as well. And then the other one, What America Believes About Homelessness, is a really exciting new report. You can see it just came out in December from Invisible People. And I simply adore this organization because they are out there on the front lines telling the stories of people who are unsheltered and experiencing literal homelessness. And this is a great resource for understanding how our general public thinks about homelessness. And it's also extremely timely because it captures this weird moment where people are focusing on housing and homelessness because of COVID. And it has some really insightful things for us to be thinking about as we're talking about the next stage of what homelessness looks like in our state. So both of these, if you download the PDF, are linked. They're hyperlinks for these images that take you directly to these reports. Allison mentioned that we'll be sending a follow-up email. I'll make sure that you get those in the follow-up email as well, and that you can take a look at them directly. So let's talk about race. I did kind of preface all of this by saying that disparities, and specifically racial disparities, were intentionally focused on by the writing team because we feel like it is time for us to be more direct in talking about this. I encourage all of you to not shy away from these conversations, to use this report as a starting point, or for those of you who are already out there, and there are a lot of you doing really great racial disparity work within your communities, just use this as one more piece of collateral for how you talk about racial disparities in your work and in your communities. So we have an excellent letter from the Lieutenant Governor talking about racial disparities. And I just pulled a quote there for you guys to read. And then we have a comparison of the data so that you can see that 52% of our homeless population are Black, but they only represent 14% of our state's total population. So that's one crucial data point for us to acknowledge. The other is that we like to be first in the state of Michigan, but this is one place where we don't want to be. And unfortunately, we're ahead of the national average here. Michigan trends higher than the national average by 12% when we're talking about the percentage of our population who are Black and experiencing homelessness. And so these are things that, first of all, we just need to set out there and acknowledge. That's what the data tells us. Then on the next slide, we'll get into that context because we don't want to leave the story there. We don't want to stop with the numbers and say, and now you can interpret that as you will. We want to provide the context so that people understand why we have such high disparities and why we need to be focusing on this. So again, this language is pulled directly from the annual report. There's a racial disparity page with that opening paragraph about catastrophic events, and we just call it what it is, that we have had a history of segregation, slavery, and all of that has led to what we're currently seeing in our communities when it comes to disparities, racial disparities, and homelessness. The graphs are all pulled from the subpages, and it highlights for you within the subpopulations the percentage of those experiencing homelessness who are also Black. And you can see for a lot of our subpopulations, that the Black population is more than 50%. But then we also provide the context to kind of place that a little bit more into some more accessible data points for you to use in your communications. So this last paragraph is pulled from the Families with Children subpage, and it talks about, in addition to some of the data I shared earlier about the affordability of rent, it talks about how Black households actually experience a higher level of rent burden, which means that they have difficulty affording necessities because they pay more than 30% of their income on housing. So 44% of Black households are considered rent burden compared to 26% of white households. And I believe, if I'm remembering my data correctly, that is a national data point. So altogether, we're now not just introducing the data point of how many of our homeless population are Black versus white, we're telling you why. And so again, I encourage all of you, use this. When you're talking about racial disparities, use this report to illustrate and to provide a broader narrative for what we're seeing in the state of Michigan. So now let's talk about advocacy. And I'm hoping that a lot of you on the call have been involved with MICA's advocacy at the state and federal level, but I also know you're doing amazing work at the local level too, in talking about what we need to prevent and end homelessness locally and across the state. So when you're advocating for proven solutions, remember, you are the expert. Decision makers, and here I'm talking about our federal, our state, our local decision makers, all of them, they get lost in the numbers or the stories. We all know that certain people gravitate towards data or gravitate towards those personal narratives that really tug on your heartstrings. It's our responsibility to make sure they understand both, because that's the only way they're going to get a clear picture about what's actually happening out in their state. So bring your local data, bring your success stories and the needs that are specific to your community. When you're advocating, make it local for them. Make sure that they understand what's happening in their district and in their communities. But don't lose sight of the big picture of ending homelessness more broadly than just you're in your program or in your agency. Make sure that you're bringing this annual report so that you can talk about homelessness across the state and the things that we're seeing everywhere within our state, and bring that back to how you are fighting homelessness within your agency and within your volunteer or your staff work. But just remember, you're the expert and you're the one that they want to talk to understand what's really happening. And here, I want to pause and bring in my coworker, Jerry, to talk about outcomes, because as we're talking about all this demographic data and all this context, we also need to be focusing on what we're doing and how it's working. So Jerry, you want to talk to us about how we can focus on outcomes?
Absolutely. And thank you, Laurel, very much. And thank you for a wonderful webinar so far. So we have determined, and this isn't just a Michigan thing, this is actually based on a bigger national initiative, that we find that there are really four key measures when we begin looking at homelessness that are interrelated, and we call these primary measures, in that what they do is they indicate to us how effective we are at actually addressing the issue of resolving homelessness. And many of you have heard the phrase that many of the national partners use, including the National Alliance to End Homelessness, about keeping homelessness as rare, brief, and non-recurring as possible. Well, this is really centered around that idea, that concept, that vision, that what we want to do is, if somebody does experience homelessness, that we want to keep that incident as rare, as brief, and as non-recurring as possible, so that we can get these households, these families back into housing and keeping them housed. So what we found is that there are four key measures that we can really look at that really tell the story. Number one, reducing new episodes of homelessness. Obviously, this is the obvious one. At the end of the day, we want to reduce or eliminate the number of persons, the number of households which experience homelessness. So that is usually the very obvious one that we all look to. Second one is going to be reducing the length of time that people are homeless. The longer that somebody's homeless, the more instability and insecurity they face, and really the more difficult. And if you look at it from experiencing homelessness, people who experience episodes of homelessness live through traumatic events. Being homeless is a traumatic event. And if we keep that length of time homeless as short as possible, it's going to help to reduce the trauma that individuals are facing when they experience homelessness. The third one is increase the percentage of discharge to stable housing and retention in permanent housing. So again, the idea to fix homelessness is pretty simple. Housing is the answer to homelessness. And so if we get people moving into permanent housing and staying in permanent housing, we are resolving that issue of homelessness for them. Then, of course, the fourth one is to reduce the number of returns to homelessness. So when people get to permanent housing, we're not seeing them cycle back into homelessness at a later point. So we actually in the annual report look at this in four ways. So measure one, we look at the number of persons who experience a first-time homeless episode, and they have not had a additional homeless experience within the previous 24 months. So one good thing that we've been seeing across the time window from 2017 to 2019 is our numbers have gone down by just over 3,200 people in the state of Michigan. And again, this is telling that story that we have had fewer people experiencing homelessness. Also, second one, and when we look at it, the total length of time within a homeless experience for households, what we are seeing is that we've seen a reduction from 92 days to 55 days, which is a reduction of 37%. Now, I will say that there is some degree of this, which is a measurement issue, that as people have been using better data quality and data collection methods, that number is being reduced due to the fact that data collection has been better. But at the same time, we have been seeing that agencies across the state are more focused on getting people out of shelter and into housing in a quicker manner, which means that this is going to ultimately lead to the reduction of this measure. Measure number three, looking at the persons of people exiting to stable housing or retaining permanent housing. Here's the key thing about this is what this basically means is if they're exiting, let's say from shelter to permanent housing, obviously that's a positive destination. But if we had them in some form of permanent housing project like rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing, if they across the year that we're doing the measurement, if they're staying in the housing, that's also a win. So there's two portions of the win. So what we're looking at is we did see a reduction in street outreach by about 33%. This is not as concerning as what it may look like at first, because what it means is we're getting more and more street outreach programs on the system and collecting data. And with that fact, that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the reduction of performance in this rate. So until we really get a good benchmark, this number is not necessarily going to indicate much because of the fact that we do not have street outreach as widespread as it could be. But then when we begin looking at things such as shelters and transitional and rapid rehousing, we're seeing that we're running right about 48%. We went up to 51% in 2018, but we're back at 48%, which we're about stable where we've been. The big thing that I do want to tout as a win here is when we look at the percentage of people who are retaining housing in permanent housing or exiting to some other form of permanent housing, we are up to 97%. And this is a win. This is basically at this point, if we're in this upper 90% range, this is really something that is what I would call in a maintenance window area that we want to keep this level of performance. This performance is really good. It may be possible to get a little higher, but honestly, at this point, that's really performing. That's like almost A plus territory here. So we want to keep doing that. And then just looking real quick, sorry about that, Allison. The last one just shows the number of people who have been in permanent housing, but then returned to homelessness. We have seen a little bit of a decrease in this across the 2017 to 2019. This is something that is one of those things that we do look at when we see this type of performance decrease, because we have seen a drop of anywhere from 3 to 5%. So these are the types of things that we want to take a look at and keep our eye on with quality improvement and performance and outcomes.
Thank you, Jerry. Was there anything else that you'd like to say about kind of how we can focus on outcomes in our advocacy?
I think the big thing to do is when you focus on outcomes, number one, celebrate your wins. So when you're talking to partners and you're talking to people out in the field, whether they be community stakeholders, community leaders, make sure to show where you have experienced wins and stress those as being improvements in how you're providing services. But then honestly, if there are some areas that are struggling that are performance, be honest with those who are hearing the information, say, yes, we know that there are some challenges here. Really begin to dig in, understand what are the factors that are causing those challenges, and come back to some of those stakeholders saying how you plan to address those things moving forward.
Thanks, Jerry. I really appreciate that. As we kind of talk about outcomes, I think that Jerry teed us up really well for then kind of talking about what comes next. And that is our solutions, right? We're doing really well in some areas. We could do better in others, but overall, we're all working together. But there are still some things we need if we're going to be successful. And so this graphic from the annual report really is a call to action. And it is on the executive summary page. And I do encourage you guys, if you're out there using this report, have it folded back to that executive summary page, because it has a great, it's a great resource as a quick one pager for people to kind of understand homelessness and understand where we need to go. So our calls to action, create policies at the local, state, federal level that center cross-sector collaboration among various service delivery systems. Cross-sector collaboration is something that we focus on heavily throughout this entire report, because we see so much opportunity for all of our sectors to be working together, to be recognizing that intersect, and to be pulling resources and policies that actually complement each other, so that we're moving together, we're moving forward together in our solutions. Advocate for more affordable and stable housing in your community. This one I think we can all kind of get behind and agree to. Those are things that we need everywhere across the state. But it's something that our decision makers still need to hear. And then engage in efforts to transform the homeless service delivery system through a racial equity lens. Again, so many of you are out there doing this work on the ground in your communities, and I applaud you. I'm hopeful that this report can complement and supplement the work that you're already doing, and that for those of you who haven't taken this up, that you're looking at this report as a way to start. And let's go ahead and keep going, then we'll come back to some questions that I see coming in. Each one of those subpopulation pages has a specific call to action at the very bottom. And so if you are a provider or an individual who focuses on, say, youth homelessness or veteran homelessness, the writing team pulled language that really provides kind of a roadmap for where we can be advocating and where we can be going with our solutions when we're talking with decision makers. So these are just a couple things that I pulled as examples to kind of help you when you're talking about things that we need to be doing. Again, cross-sector collaboration. Some of these are very specific. So I was talking about supports for youth, or for child welfare and things that help families exit homelessness. And then on the next page, Allison, we have a couple more that have even more specific calls to action. So here we have that cross-sector collaboration again, focusing on increasing Medicaid, drawing in the examples of success, recognizing the areas for improvement, but acknowledging that there is a specific thing that we can be doing, that we can be passing at our legislative or our congressional level that will improve the lives, the health, and the housing outcomes for those experiencing homelessness. And we need to be having these direct conversations and just putting this on the table when we're talking to decision makers. And again, you know, safe and affordable housing, that is a need across the state. And people should have access to homes in their communities of choice. And again, calling in the racial disparity aspect of all of the advocacy that we're doing. Next page, or next slide. And here I'm going to pull Jerry back in to talk about advocating within the system.
Very good, thank you. So one thing that just for you all to be aware of is every year our Micah HMIS team sends a core demographics report, usually in mid to late spring, to all the COCs and local planning bodies in the state of Michigan. So this will typically go to COC or local planning body leadership or HMIS assistant administrators, with the intent that they can feel free to widely distribute it to their additional COC leadership. And what we really encourage them to do is to take a look at this data and review it in meeting context. So whether that be at a local planning body meeting, whether that be at a regional meeting, or you do it in performance and evaluation in a reports committee, really whatever the structure is within your community that is set up to do that, that's where you want to do that. But the point of it is you really want to get a good idea of what the groups of people look like that you're serving within your homeless service delivery system. So this, even though it doesn't necessarily have outcomes on this portion of it, what it really does is it really paints the picture of what the people who are experiencing homelessness look like in your community. So for example, as you're beginning to look through the report, what you'll see is that things such as race and ethnicity are going to be spelled out in there. Gender will be spelled out in there. Obviously, disabilities and disabling conditions will be in there, as well as other subpopulation types. And if you really want to use this data to the fullest extent of what is possible, one thing that we really would encourage you, like Laura was talking about earlier, that we're really shifting from a statewide leadership perspective, our focus to be more intent on looking at racial disparities. So one thing we do is look at your local community and look at what the general population makeup, both racially and ethnically, of the population in your general community is, and compare that to the racial and ethnic breakdown of persons experiencing homelessness. See if there is a differential there. See if there is some racial disparities there that exist. And then also begin to look at some of your subpopulations. So look at veterans, look at single adults, look at families with children in them. How do those populations stack up against other the general population within your community? And does that point to any unique challenges that you may have within your service delivery system, where you may have unmet needs among those people you are serving, or that there may be some persons within your community who are having more of a challenge getting and finding ways to get to housing and stay housed. So that report is really a real gold mine for data that you can use to understand and to strategically plan how you're addressing issues of homelessness. And so we really encourage you to use that as such.
Oops, I was the one who forgot to unmute myself. Apologies. Thank you, Jerry, for that. So as you guys can all see, there's so many different ways that we can be using this report in our communications, you know, at all levels of our work. I love that Jerry talks about how we can use this in our internal reflections on our programming, and the way that our community needs to kind of dig into the data and really understand what's happening so that we can make improvements. So now that you've had a chance to kind of go through the report and think about the broader narrative and think about the ways that it can be used in your own work, what's next? Obviously, we hope that you will continue to have conversations with multiple stakeholders in your communities. and with those within your organization, with your staff and your volunteers and those experiencing homelessness who you serve. And then we hope that you'll participate in opportunities that happen all over the state and at the federal level, such as our upcoming 5th annual Homelessness Advocacy Day. There are a lot of things that are going to look different this year. So this image is from last year. It was literally like a week before things closed down due to COVID in the state. So this is one of the last times that I personally got to interact with a large group of people without masks, and everybody was able to stand close to each other. And it feels like such a strange world to be in, where you can look at this picture and see all of the amazing advocates who were able to come to Lansing and talk to their legislators about solutions and what we're seeing in our communities. So this year is going to be different. This year we're hoping to have virtual advocacy day, still scheduling opportunities for you to meet with your legislator in the state house and senate and talk about homelessness. We have policy priorities that we have developed through our Legislative Action Committee, and we'll be preparing talking points and materials for you to share that will hopefully move the hearts and minds of our decision makers towards some of those proven solutions for preventing and ending homelessness. I am going to share one last poll. And this is just for my sense. If asked today, would you participate in our virtual advocacy day? And right now we don't have a registration open, but we do have a target date of March 16th. So your options: sign me up. I want to, but that day won't work for me. I'm interested, but I'm not sure. And there could be a lot of reasons why you're not sure. You're not sure if you can participate due to time, or if your work will allow you to do so, or maybe you're not comfortable or confident with advocating. All of those are things that we can talk with you about. And then final option: sorry, not this year. So as people are voting, I see about half of our audience today has voted. I'll just give it another second. But I want to speak to that last bullet point of I want to, but that day won't work for me. One of the good things about trying to hold a virtual advocacy day is that we have a lot more flexibility. Usually we try to bring everybody to Lansing on the same day, get you scheduled with meetings with your legislators, with a large group, and try to handle everything in like a span of 5 hours, which is exhausting but awesome. Since we can't do that this year, we have the ability to schedule meetings outside of that March 16th date. I'd love to still schedule them sometime that week, but if you want to participate in March 16th, really doesn't work for you, we have options. So that's something that we can talk about. And I'm going to go ahead and close our poll and share our results. And okay, we're about split between sign me up and I'm interested but not sure. And then a couple of you want to, but obviously the time won't work, or are not able to participate this year. If you fall into the camp of I'm interested but not sure, please reach out and let's talk about what we can do to make you comfortable, or to find a way for you to be able to participate given other obligations or requirements you have, perhaps with workloads. We can find ways to get you interacting with your state legislators and talking about homelessness beyond just this opportunity. And then of course, if you want to, but that day doesn't work for you, let us know as well. We can find a solution for you. And Allison, I think the next slide is just asking if we have any questions from the group. So it's been a quiet group, which means that either my monotone voice has put everyone to sleep, or something else more exciting is happening. But do we have any questions coming in?
We have one.
Okay.
And then we had a comment. It's a picture of hope for the future. I think it was about all those folks together, right?
Oh, that's much better than how I framed it. I appreciate that.
We have when it comes to, oops, now we're getting a lot. When it comes to, I'm sorry, everyone. When it comes to outcomes, what about the level of housing stability? Is it stable due to they are in a place, or is it one in which it's not healthy and they aren't living to the best of their abilities due to their housing? Such as housing is negatively affecting their physical health and mental health and healing from the trauma of homelessness.
That's a good question, and it's really really unique question. One of the things, if you've worked in homelessness with us for any period of time, you know that there is definitely a unique challenge where you take the living situations and the factors that real life human beings experience and try to put them into the very black and white world of a database, because obviously a database is not good at reflecting some of the unique nuance that happens in people's lives. And again, this is a good situation where there isn't necessarily a way to evaluate that or that granularity of it. Typically, the way that we do the evaluation and the measurement is based on one of two categories of living situation. So if somebody is going into permanent housing, that would be a permanent destination. If somebody is going into a temporary or unstable destination, that would be considered to be a temporary destination. And how we break that up is the permanent versus the temporary is really the indicator of whether or not there's been a success in getting somebody into housing. Now, obviously, when people discharge, there isn't always the way that case managers are able to follow up and do evaluation in terms of what is the exact nature of that permanent housing. So some of those questions that are being referred to here aren't being answered. But that's again going to be one of the challenges of data is being able to see it on a scale of granularity of is this a healthy environment, is it an unhealthy environment. Largely, we'd hope that if it's really unhealthy environment, it would likely be a temporary destination that somebody would transition out of, and then permanent destinations would be more destinations which would be healthier, helping people to heal from the trauma of experiencing homelessness.
Thank you. A few people have also asked who to contact about Advocacy Day, and that would be Laurel. And then they asked how, and I put her email in the chat. It's also on the second page of this PowerPoint, which is included right now in GoToWebinar, and you'll also be receiving in the mail or in your email after. Someone is asking, are there sources for grants for homeless housing? So I don't know if either of you want to tackle that. So I can. So there are grants. So I guess I would need more information. So if you want to contact me, there's a lot of them, and I'm not really sure, what you mean for focusing that. So I put my information into the chat.
And I think that one thing that we could really emphasize is if you're interested in looking into that, please get involved with your local COC and your local planning body, because that's really where a lot of these funding decisions are made. And if you're at the table with your COC, your local planning body, it's going to give you a good understanding of what are some of the other agencies involved, how you all work together. And then maybe if you're looking at it for your agency, are there any unique needs that you can fill within a service delivery system, within a gap that may not be filled by somebody else, so that obviously you could use some available funding to help provide some much needed services for people that may otherwise be underserved.
Thanks. That was great, Jerry.
And if I can bring it back to my favorite topic of advocacy, this is exactly the kind of thing that we need to be talking with our decision makers about, is like where there are gaps for funding, where there's opportunities to bring in state resources or federal resources to support programming that we really do need here in the state. So that's not at all the question that was asked. I just want to bring it back to like, when we have an opportunity to bend the ear of a decision maker and talk about where we need funds and where we need resources, we've got to take advantage of that opportunity and use this report, use this data, use our experiences to bring them on board as a champion for ending homelessness.
Thank you. Okay, we have two more right now. I think it is so important to allow those we serve being at the table and advocating. What is the best way to get folks prepared to do this? Would love to encourage those who are unsure in participating in Legislative Action Day to get out there. It is truly a rewarding experience to be part of advocacy on this level. Last year was my first, and I look forward to many more. So a comment, and then also how can you get people experiencing homelessness involved?
Thanks, Allison. And I think that was actually perhaps a question and then a separate person submitted the comment. So let me address the question about getting people who have experienced homelessness to be part of our advocacy. There are a lot of different ways to do this. And I think ultimately what we try to lay out, and here I'm going to be speaking from a narrow perspective of our Advocacy Day, is we try to make sure that people feel confident and comfortable. And the way that we try to accomplish that is by providing the information in advance, so people have an opportunity to kind of feel like they understand what they're talking about before they get in front of a decision maker or a legislator. And then we make space, right? We try to encourage them to recognize that they are the experts of their own experience and of the experience of so many that are in the community who are walking similar paths, and make space for them to tell that story. And I will be 100% honest with you guys. I love using this report in trying to explain data and trends and narratives. But if I have the opportunity to get someone to talk about their personal experience with the decision maker, that's where the power lies. That's where our legislators want to be involved and want to hear what's happening. So communicate that with the people who you're trying to bring to the table, because if they know the power that they have in sharing their story, I have seen more interest and more confidence in participating in the process. There's programs and resources, there's worksheets and a lot of things that we can build up or that already exist that we can make sure people have access to. But for me personally, it's all about like making sure people recognize their value and are comfortable and confident in the process.
Thanks, Laurel. We have another question that had come in while you were answering that. Someone is wondering, what are the major reasons for people to go back to homeless status after being in permanent supportive housing? And in what ways, oh, sorry. And in what ways can we prevent them from becoming homeless?
I was going to say, do you want to tag team on this one, Laurel? Because there are a couple answers to, so there isn't necessarily one clear-cut answer to this question, as you can probably imagine. Some of the things that we commonly see as reasons people return to homelessness after discharging to permanent housing. Number one, kind of referring to the question that was asked earlier, maybe there may be something in the environment they're discharging to, say, for instance, if they're discharging to family or friends, where there's an unresolved problem there that may lead to returns to homelessness. Another thing that's always been a factor is lack of client choice. If a client is not able to go into an environment, and by this we're not referring to getting, you know, a house that is 10,000 square feet, but again, some things like discharging into housing that's in unsafe neighborhoods, or housing that is substandard, subpar, where some of the critical needs of life are not being met in that housing. Or again, sometimes it's a factor of people become homeless because of loss of income, loss of employment, unresolved healthcare, medical, mental health issues, substance use issues. So there is often a wide range of factors that come into as why people discharge from permanent housing back to homelessness. And it really is a good idea to understand clients and understand some of the basic needs, which are things that they're experiencing. And then when you get them back into housing, because obviously we talk about housing first, because housing first is critical, but not housing first being housing alone, in that you are also going back, and as you notice as case managers, that there are other things from health issues to mental health issues, for example, to unresolved interpersonal relationships, that you continue to have the client work on those things so that they can have more success in retaining permanent housing.
I don't have anything to add. I think Jerry's got it. Allison, I don't know if you wanted to say anything and have the final word. I see we're bumping right up against 4 o'clock.
Nope, I think that was great. We do have one more question just came in, and it was just a thank you. So I will second that. Thank you everyone for attending our webinar and taking the time to learn how to advocate even better for the work that you're doing every day. And I would like to thank Laurel and Jerry for speaking, and look for some communications coming from me in the next couple days with this presentation, as well as the follow-up materials.
Thank you, Allison.
You.
Have a good day, all.